You don't know who to trust. You don't know who knows what. Why didn't anybody come forward? Why didn't anybody say anything?
The funeral home workers had seen thousands of bodies, natural deaths, peaceful passings, the expected end to long lives. But as their hands moved methodically over Ray Neal's body that summer afternoon in Norcross, Georgia, they froze. Beneath the assumption of a quiet death lay evidence of savage betrayal, multiple stab wounds, deliberately inflicted, carefully hidden. The kind man who had opened his door to everyone had been murdered in his own home, and for 3 long years his killer had walked free. The police missed it. The investigators missed it. Even the medical examiner missed it. They all saw what they expected to see. An elderly man with health problems who had simply passed away in his sleep. That's exactly what the killer had counted on. That's exactly why they chose him. But they didn't count on his niece Ashley, who turned her grief into a relentless pursuit of truth. They didn't expect a family's love to be stronger than their perfect murder. And they never imagined that their carefully constructed facade would crumble because of one small detail, a single fingerprint that would finally expose a predator hiding in plain sight.
Would anybody ever be charged, or would it just be a cold case that just goes on for years and years to come?
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case.
There's something about small towns that makes neighbors feel like family. In Norcross, Georgia, Ray Neal wasn't just another resident. He was the kind of person who made the community feel like home. His weathered hands had helped countless neighbors with their gardens. His gentle smile had greeted morning joggers for decades, and his front porch had been a sanctuary for anyone needing a moment of peace or a friendly ear. To his niece Ashley Haynes, Ray was the steady heartbeat of their family. He wasn't just an uncle who showed up at holidays or sent birthday cards. He was there for first days of school, for scraped knees, for teenage heartbreaks, and for adult victories. In a world where father figures sometimes fade away, Ray Neal stood firm. His home on that quiet Norcross street wasn't just a house. It was where Sunday dinners turned into storytelling sessions, where family traditions were born, where memories were woven into the very fabric of their lives. Even as age began leaving its mark and health issues tried to slow him down, Ray's spirit remained undiminished. His battle with hypertension might have affected his body, but it never touched his heart. If anything, his physical challenges only made him more determined to be there for his family. He'd joke that his medical conditions were just life's way of making sure he took enough breaks to appreciate the good things. The neighbors noticed how he'd still be out there, maybe moving a little slower, but never missing a chance to wave, to ask about their kids, to share a piece of wisdom or a warm laugh. That was Ray Neal, a man whose presence made others feel seen, heard, and valued. He was proof that true strength isn't measured in physical power, but in the capacity to make others feel loved. Little did anyone know that Ray's gentle nature, the very quality that made him so beloved, would make him vulnerable to someone who saw kindness as weakness and trust as an opportunity for betrayal.
In both cases, the same weapon was used. It was a large kitchen knife.
The morning of July 25th, 2019, started like any other summer day in Norcross. The Georgia sun was already pressing down on the pavement when Ashley Haynes pulled into her uncle's driveway. 3 days of unanswered calls had turned worry into a gnawing fear she couldn't shake. Ray Neal never let a call from his niece go unreturned, not in all the years she could remember. The house stood silent, too silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, wrong, like the air itself is holding its breath. Ashley would later say that even before she opened the door, something inside her already knew. But knowing and seeing are two different kinds of pain. The scene that greeted her seemed peaceful enough at first glance. Ray appeared to be sleeping in his bed, as if he had simply drifted off and never woken up. For a moment, there was almost relief. His known health issues, the hypertension, he'd battled, it all pointed to a natural end. When the police arrived, they saw what everyone else saw. An elderly man with documented medical conditions who had passed away in his sleep. But Ashley couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way the room felt, or perhaps it was just that sixth sense that comes from knowing someone your whole life. The responding officers assured her that everything pointed to natural causes. The medical history made sense. The scene was undisturbed. Her uncle had simply reached the end of his journey. As family members began arriving, their grief was tinged with a bittersweet acceptance. They shared memories, made phone calls, began the painful process of planning a funeral. They told themselves that at least he hadn't suffered, that he had gone peacefully in his sleep. They held on to that comfort as they went through his belongings, as they picked out his burial clothes, as they wrote his obituary. But sometimes peace is just a mask that violence wears, and the truth that Ashley sensed, the wrongness she couldn't name, was waiting to be discovered on a cold steel table at the funeral home, where death's final secrets can't stay hidden for long. In the clinical light of the funeral home, as staff members began their careful work, the mask of natural causes began to slip. What they found beneath turned grief into horror, peace into violence, and acceptance into burning questions that demanded answers. The discovery was brutal in its simplicity. Stab wounds, multiple and methodical, telling a story so different from what everyone had believed. These weren't minor marks that could have been overlooked in casual observation. These were deliberate wounds, each one a testament to an act of violence that had been hidden behind the convenient narrative of natural causes. When the funeral home staff made that call to the police, everything changed. The peaceful passing they'd all accepted shattered like glass, leaving behind sharp edges of truth that cut deep into the family's hearts. Ray Neal hadn't drifted away quietly in his sleep. He had been murdered in his own home, in the very place where he had made countless people feel safe and welcome. For Ashley, the revelation was both vindication and devastation. That nagging feeling she'd had, the sense that something wasn't right, it hadn't been paranoia or grief playing tricks on her mind. It had been her connection to her uncle, reaching beyond death to point toward the truth. But with that vindication came a tidal wave of questions and a new kind of pain. How had this been missed? Why hadn't anyone looked closer? What else had been overlooked? The case was immediately reclassified as a homicide. But those precious first days after death, crucial hours when evidence is freshest and leads are warmest, had been lost to the assumption of natural causes. The house hadn't been treated as a crime scene. People had moved freely through the space, inadvertently disturbing whatever clues the killer might have left behind. Time, that relentless enemy of justice, had been given a head start. As the family absorbed this horrifying new reality, their grief transformed into something else, a determined anger, a need for answers, a demand for justice. The peaceful farewell they had planned became a call to action. Ray Neal's death was no longer just a tragedy to be mourned. It was a crime that needed to be solved, a wrong that needed to be righted, a truth that needed to be brought into the light. Someone had walked away from that house thinking they had committed the perfect crime, believing that Ray's medical history would hide their brutal act. They hadn't counted on the careful eyes of funeral home workers, or the relentless love of a family that would soon begin their own quest for justice. The truth had emerged from death's shadow, and now there was no turning back. The ripples of the funeral home's discovery turned what should have been a time of mourning into a scramble for answers. Detectives who had dismissed the scene days earlier now returned with different eyes, but time had already taken its toll. What they found was a crime scene diluted by days of innocent intrusion. Family members coming and going, personal items moved, surfaces touched. The killer's traces, if they had left any, were now mixed with the ordinary signs of grief and remembrance. The initial sweep of Ray's home revealed something both telling and troubling. No signs of forced entry. The windows were intact, the locks undisturbed. This wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. Whoever had done this had likely been someone Ray knew, someone he had trusted enough to open his door to. The thought sent chills through the family. The killer might not just be a faceless stranger, but someone who had sat at Ray's table, someone who had known his routines, someone who might even now be watching their investigation unfold. Neighbors, when questioned again, began to remember things differently.
People kind of put it together in the neighborhood and started giving us calls and, giving their ideas of what they thought happened.
One recalled seeing an unfamiliar car parked on the street in the days leading up to Ray's death. Another mentioned hearing what they thought was an argument late at night, but had dismissed it as unimportant at the time. These fragments of memory, while valuable, were frustratingly vague, like trying to piece together a puzzle where the edges had been worn smooth by time. The detectives faced an uphill battle. Physical evidence that might have been crucial, fingerprints, DNA, signs of struggle, had been compromised by the initial misclassification of Ray's death. Security cameras in the area were few, and those that existed had already overwritten their footage from the critical time frame. Each passing day seemed to make the trail colder, the answers more elusive. What emerged instead was a portrait of Ray's final days, pieced together from receipts, phone records, and witness statements. He had gone about his routine as usual, visiting the local grocery store, chatting with neighbors, tending to his garden. There were no signs of distress, no indication that he felt threatened. Ray Neal had lived his last days exactly as he had lived all the others, with kindness, with routine, with trust in his fellow man. That trust, it seemed, had been his undoing. As leads dried up and witnesses' memories faded, the case began to slip from the headlines. But while the official investigation might have been stalling, another one was just beginning. Driven not by badges and protocols, but by a niece's love and a family's refusal to let Ray's murder go unanswered.
And it's just been hard trying to figure out what happened and who did it.
Ashley Haynes realized that justice for her uncle wouldn't come from waiting. She transformed her grief into purpose, her dining room table becoming a makeshift command center, papers, notes, and timeline sketches spread across its surface, a testament to her refusal to let Ray's case grow cold. She wasn't a trained detective, but she had something perhaps more valuable, an intimate knowledge of her uncle's world and a determination that wouldn't quit. Every day after work, Ashley would drive through Ray's neighborhood, talking to anyone who would listen. She learned the rhythms of the community, who was always on their porch, who walked their dogs at specific times, who might have seen something without realizing its importance. She kept detailed notes of every conversation, every small detail that might later prove significant. Her car became a familiar sight on those streets, a rolling reminder that someone was still asking questions. It was during these conversations that a name began to surface, whispered at first, then spoken with increasing frequency. Carmen Marie Hunt. The mentions came in fragments. A neighbor who had seen her lurking near Ray's house. Another who remembered her asking strange questions about who lived alone in the area. Hunt wasn't a stranger to the neighborhood, but she wasn't quite part of it either. She existed in the margins, appearing and disappearing like a shadow at the edge of vision. When Ashley brought Hunt's name to investigators, their response was frustratingly non-committal. Yes, they would look into it. Yes, they would add it to their notes. But without concrete evidence, Hunt was just another name in a file growing thick with dead ends. The system's gears turned slowly, too slowly for a niece watching her uncle's case fade from public memory. Refusing to be silenced, Ashley turned to the media. She learned to tell Ray's story in a way that made people care, that made them see past the statistics and headlines to the human being who had been lost. She spoke at community meetings, wrote letters to editors, created social media posts that kept her uncle's case alive in the public consciousness. Each interview was emotionally draining, forcing her to relive the worst day of her life. But she pushed through the pain. Ray had never given up on her. She wouldn't give up on him. Through it all, Ashley drew strength from memories of her uncle. She could almost hear his voice encouraging her, feel his steady presence guiding her forward. The same man who had taught her to ride a bike, who had celebrated her graduations, who had walked her down the aisle at her wedding, was now teaching her one final lesson about persistence, about love, about fighting for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. The investigation might have slowed to a crawl in official channels, but in the hearts and minds of those who loved Ray Neal, it never stopped. 3 years is a long time to carry the weight of an unsolved murder. 3 years of holidays without Ray, of birthdays marked by his absence, of questions that seemed destined to go unanswered. But in 2022, a seemingly unrelated arrest would crack open the case that had haunted the Neal family for so long. Carmen Marie Hunt's arrest for a violent assault in another part of town didn't make major headlines. It was just another booking, another set of fingerprints entered into the system. But those fingerprints would prove to be the key that unlocked everything. When they were run through the database, they matched evidence found at Ray's house. Evidence that had been waiting silently for 3 years. Like a letter, finally finding its intended recipient. The match wasn't just a coincidence. It was a revelation. That single bloody fingerprint placed Hunt definitively in Ray's home on the night of his death. The phantom that Ashley had been chasing, the name that had been whispered in neighborhood conversations, suddenly had substance. The pieces began falling into place with devastating clarity.
They said that they thought Carmen Hunt may have done this. She had done the same thing to someone else and was currently in our jail. And in both cases, the same weapon was used. It was a large kitchen knife. One of the things that I saw in pictures was a bloody fingerprint. Ultimately, they did match that to Carmen Hunt.
As investigators dug deeper into Hunt's history, a chilling pattern emerged. She had a record of targeting vulnerable individuals, particularly older residents who lived alone. Her method was to gain trust, to exploit kindness, to turn generosity into opportunity. Ray Neal, with his open heart and trusting nature, would have been the perfect target for someone like her. The witnesses, who had been hesitant to speak before, now found their voices. One neighbor remembered seeing Hunt watching Ray's house in the days leading up to his death, noting how she seemed to track his comings and goings. Another recalled an interaction between Hunt and Ray, him offering help, her playing the role of someone in need. What had seemed like unremarkable moments at the time now took on sinister significance. For investigators, the fingerprint was just the beginning. Armed with this new evidence, they began reconstructing the events of that July night. The lack of forced entry made sense now. Ray would have opened his door to Hunt, perhaps offering help, as he had done so many times before. The multiple stab wounds spoke of a calculated attack, not a crime of passion. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a sudden burst of violence. This was premeditated, planned, precise. The breakthrough hit the Neal family like a thunderbolt. For Ashley, who had carried her uncle's case like a torch through 3 years of darkness, the news brought a storm of emotions. Relief warred with renewed grief. Validation clashed with anger at time lost. But above all, there was a fierce satisfaction in knowing that her instincts had been right, that her persistence had played a role in keeping the case alive until science and circumstance could bring the truth to light.
I don't know if we're ever going to be relieved because we lost someone senselessly, but I think it's a sense of peace, yes.
Hunt's past started unraveling like a loose thread pulled from a sweater. Other victims came forward, speaking of encounters that had left them uneasy. A pattern of predatory behavior emerged, suggesting that Ray's murder might not have been an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern that had finally been exposed. In a courthouse far removed from the peaceful streets of Ray Neal's neighborhood, Carmen Marie Hunt stood before justice with the same coldness that had marked her crimes. Her face betrayed no emotion as the charges were read. Felony murder and aggravated assault. The legal terms attempting to capture the magnitude of what she had stolen from the Neal family. The evidence against her was now overwhelming. That single fingerprint had opened a floodgate, leading to more discoveries that painted a picture of calculated malice. The prosecution's case was built not just on forensic evidence, but on the pattern of Hunt's behavior, the testimonies of neighbors, and the methodical reconstruction of Ray's final hours. In the stark light of the courtroom, there was nowhere left for lies to hide. For the Neal family, watching Hunt face charges was a moment loaded with complexity. Relief mingled with renewed grief as every detail of Ray's murder was laid bare in clinical legal terms. Ashley sat in the courtroom each day, her presence a silent testament to the promise she had made to never give up. But there was one person notably absent, Ray's sister, Michelle, who had passed away before seeing justice served. Her absence was yet another wound that Hunt had inflicted, another moment of closure stolen from the family. Hunt's demeanor throughout the proceedings was perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. She showed no remorse, no recognition of the lives she had shattered. When offered the chance to speak, to explain, to show any humanity, she remained silent. It was as if Ray Neal had been nothing more than an opportunity to her, not a human being with a family who loved him, with a life full of meaning and connection. The verdict, when it came, felt less like a triumph and more like the closing of a terrible chapter. Hunt's conviction brought consequences she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of. The sentence handed down ensured she would spend decades behind bars, but for the Neal family, no number of years could truly balance the scales. Ray was still gone, his gentle presence still missed at every family gathering, every holiday, every quiet Sunday afternoon. Yet in the midst of this bittersweet justice, there was also healing. The community that had supported the Neal family throughout their ordeal that came together again, not just to mark the end of the legal proceedings, but to remember Ray as he had lived, not as a victim, but as the kind, generous soul who had touched so many lives. For Ashley, the conviction meant keeping her promise to both her uncle and her mother. She had carried their story through 3 years of uncertainty, had refused to let Ray's case go cold, had transformed her grief into the kind of determination that moves mountains. In the end, justice came, not just through the legal system, but through the unwavering love of a niece who refused to let her uncle's memory fade. Hunt's imprisonment wouldn't bring Ray back, wouldn't erase the pain of loss or fill the empty chair at family dinners, but it meant that the truth had finally come to light, that Ray's story hadn't ended in that moment of betrayal, and that kindness, even when exploited by those who would do harm, remains a strength rather than a weakness. Sometimes justice wears no shining armor, arrives on no white horse. Sometimes it comes through fingerprints and databases, through years of patient waiting, through the relentless love of family. Tonight's story leaves us with questions that echo beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, beyond even the resolution of this single case. What drives someone like Carmen Marie Hunt to target those whose only crime is having an open heart? How many other Ray Neals might be out there, their stories of violence hidden behind death certificates marked natural causes? Could a more thorough initial investigation have spared the Neal family 3 years of uncertainty and pain? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had that gut feeling, like Ashley did, that something wasn't quite right? How far would you go to uncover the truth for someone you love? Share your stories, your insights, your own experiences with justice delayed but not denied. And if you believe in the power of true crime storytelling to bring light to the darkness, to give voice to the voiceless, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Together, we can ensure that stories like Ray Neal's are never forgotten, that justice finds its way, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually rises to the surface. Until next time, remember, sometimes the biggest acts of courage come not from those who wear badges, but from those who refuse to let love die with their loved ones.